First there was PlayStation, aka PS1. Then there's PS2, PS3, and now PS4. And that makes sense. You'd think after Xbox, there'd be Xbox 2. But no. Next came Xbox 360. And now, after 360, comes Xbox One. Why one? Maybe that's how many seconds of thought they put into naming it.
This is Sheldon Cooper from the popular TV series The Big Bang Theory. In one series of the show, he is trying to decide which game console he should buy, PlayStation 4 or Xbox One. Yes, the whole history of game consoles is marked by a serious competition between different companies. And in this episode we are going to talk about the history of one of those consoles, the Sony PlayStation. From the year 2024, it seems that Sony with its market share has won the console war. But is it true? And isn't it losing something bigger? Hi there, and welcome to the Release Podcast. Today technologies surround us everywhere, and we can't even imagine our lives without them. But every technology started with a bold idea in someone's head. In this podcast, we talk about the technologies that have changed our lives and the people who invented them. My name is Rival. Hi. Sony PlayStation. The console that many kids did well in school, did their homework, washed dishes and cleaned the house for. Did you have this console as a child? I didn't, because it was hard to get one in my small town. But as soon as someone at school had one, they became popular and everyone wanted to be friends with them. Let's start by looking at where the history of consoles began. It's hard to say when the first arcade game machine appeared, but pinball machines existed already in the 9th century. And since then, the various game of skills popularity has only grown. The first commercial arcade video game was a computer space game, released in 1971. It was created by the future founder of the Atari company, and it didn't become popular. As the creator later commented, it was a little too complicated for the guy with a beer in the bar. The golden age of arcade video games happened in the late 70s and began with the game Space Invaders. At that time, arcade machines were everywhere. In supermarkets, restaurants, liquor stores, gas stations, and even funeral homes. In parallel with this was the development of video game consoles, which allowed you to play video games not only in the bar, but also in your living room by connecting them to your TV. The first home console was the Magnavox Odyssey, released in September 1972. In most cases, the consoles were made by the same companies that made arcade machines. The scheme looked something like this. The company would release a game first for the arcade machine, and then port popular games for the console so that users could continue playing at home with their families and children. The further development of consoles is usually divided into generations. For example, modern consoles are classified as the 9th generation. First generation consoles, as you might guess, were pretty basic. They were produced with one or several built-in games. If you want to play something else, you have to buy a new console. The concept is somewhat similar to arcade game machines. Only the second generation will bring us cartridges. It's usually a small computer chip in a plastic case containing a game. Some of us probably still have a few cartridges in our attics. And at the time, another interesting thing happened. For Atari programmers, remember that Atari company whose founder created the first console arcade game. By this time, Atari had already grown into a big corporation. So, the 4 Atari programmers from it decided to leave the company and start their own company called Activision, specializing in making games for existing consoles. Before them, there were no third-party game developers, and the games were created by the console manufacturers themselves. Activision was the first such company, and so began the phenomenon of independent game studios. As you guess, being able to sell cartridges separately from the consoles has helped a lot with that. Let's fast forward a little bit to the 4th generation of consoles. By that time, the main competitors in the market were Sega with their Genesis console, also known as Mega Drive, and Nintendo with their Super Nintendo Entertainment System or just Super Nintendo. The competition between them was quite serious. Sonic the Hedgehog versus Mario. Each vendor tried to make their console better than their competitors. And this period became one of the most important in the history of video games. This is where the Sony PlayStation story began.
皆様こんにちは、くたらぎです。さて、12月3日で25周年を迎えたプレイステーション。
This is Ken Kutaragi. He is called the father of the Sony PlayStation. At that time, he was working at Sony Digital Research Labs. Nintendo, while trying to improve their future console, approached him to design a sound chip. This is what games sound like on the previous generation of the console. And here's what they sound like with the new chip eventually designed by Ken Kutaragi. I think you can hear the difference, and it was also a breakthrough for gamers back then. But there was one problem. At that time, Sony had no interest in video game. Back then, it was a successful audio-video company, creator of the popular or even iconic Sony Walkman audio player, manufacturer of televisions, cameras, CDs, recently acquired CBS Records and Columbia Pictures. Sony focused on different kinds of entertainment, and there was already a lot of competition in the game market. And games, there's something for kids, right? So Ken Kutaragi decided to develop the chip in secret. When the executive of Sony found out about this project, they were furious. He was saved from being fired by Sony CEO Noria Oga and allowed Kutaragi to finish his work on the chip. The partnership between the two companies has proven successful. The console from Nintendo ended up being the best-selling console in the world for its fourth generation. So Nintendo decided to approach Sony once again. They wanted Sony to develop an add-on from the Super Nintendo that would allow players to run not only Nintendo cartridges, but also games on CD. At that time, CD discs were primarily used to store and play audio, and Sony had a lot of experience with that. Games on CD discs were rarely produced back then. Even what Nintendo offered had to be just an add-on that had to be bought separately. The main format would still be cartridges. This device would be called the PlayStation. But not quite the same PlayStation as it is now. There was a space between the words play and station in that version. But these plans were not meant to happen. Sony wanted to control and license all the game released on CD for Nintendo on its own. This could create a big threat to Nintendo's business, because most often the consoles themselves are released at loss, and the company will make a profit in the future from the sale and licensing of games. So Nintendo's management decided to cancel the contract without informing Sony. So, June 1991, Las Vegas, Consumer Electronics Show. Sony from the stage announces a partnership with Nintendo to work on the PlayStation. But the very next day, Nintendo said that it cancelled that agreement and signed a new contract with the European company Philips. It was a betrayal. Sony executives wanted to shut down the project and abandon the video game market. But Ken Kutaragi managed to convince the company's board of directors to continue the development and release their own console. We don't know exactly what he said, but it's rumored that wanting to respond to the humiliation from the Nintendo was one of the main arguments. The name of the console was changed to the name we are now familiar with, PlayStation, without the space anymore. Sony decided not just to release a console for gaming, but to create a new kind of entertainment. To make it something that adults would want to play too, not just kids and families. and in addition to release the most innovative console, to refuse two-dimensional games focusing entirely on 3D, and to avoid cartridges in favor of CD discs. One of the advantages of discs was the much larger storage capacity. This actually allowed developers to create three-dimensional games that sometimes just didn't fit on cartridges anymore, to use more music, sound effects, video. And what is the visual difference between a three-dimensional game and a two-dimensional one? I think you know yourself. I realize that there are a lot of fans of two-dimensional games in the world, but for the majority of customers still, three-dimensional games were more interesting. But Sony had some things to complete before releasing it, and the first of them was games. Games are really important, of course, because no matter how great and innovative a console is, you won't need it if it doesn't have good games on it. Sega and Nintendo at that time were producing games for arcade machines, and then the hits were ported to the consoles. Sony did not have its own studio, so in the very beginning they offered contracts to dozens of studios to produce games for their future console. Sony decided to make sure that there would be enough good games at the start. Besides third-party studios, Sony decided to create their own. For these purposes, they acquired a Psygnosis studio. It was supposed to develop 2 more games for the console release. Psygnosis eventually infused more than just games. Developers were not satisfied with the console's development kits, tools for creating games for PlayStation. Sony offered quite expensive workstations of their own design. Psygnosis organized a meeting between Sony's management and Ascent System Company, which had experience in creating development kits. As a result, a cheaper and more efficient system was created. But that's not all. Sony opened 3 technical support centers in London, California, and Tokyo to help and guide third-party developers. Creating three-dimensional games was quite challenging because for many developers it was their first experience. There were no ready-made solutions yet. Everything had to be made and invented by themselves. Literally, Sony's engineers could spend nights working with developers for the third-party studios, helping them or together inventing solutions to the problems. Here is how the former lead programmer of the Taken series from Namco recalls their partnership.
その時に片桐さんが見に来てくれて、ちょっとなんか午前中
Kutaragi then asked if he should send someone to help. I accepted the offer right away. After dawn, one engineer came over from Sony. He'd just gotten married at that time, so he called his wife and told her that he'd be late and that he would make it up to her. We stayed until morning. He had come up with 5 possible solutions to try to fix our problem. In the end, it was 5:30 in the morning. He said he had tried 4 of these possible solutions and only had 1 left. Everyone was exhausted. But then he said he thought it worked. We all checked it right away. It was unbelievable. It worked. The last thing he tried was the thing that worked. I want to point out once again what Sony was doing. They needed good games, so they offered third-party developers to make them. Developers complained about the hardware. Sony made it cheaper and more convenient. Developers still had problems. Sony engineers were ready to spend nights to help solve them. So, Sony tried to make game development for the upcoming console as easy and convenient as possible. The other direction that Sony was putting effort into was advertising. The commercials for the upcoming console were bold and unusual. For example, a few people sitting in an office, knocking on a desk and repeating the console release date.
1日間でゲームが変わる。12月3日、PlayStation 待て。
Or a man in a suit and rubber gloves talking about how humanity is threatened by the PlayStation.
Hello, citizens of Europe. As spokesperson for SAPS, the Society Against PlayStation, I'd like to talk to you about a menace threatening humanity. It's happening right here, in our very homes, and corrupting the lives of our loved ones. Remember, do not underestimate the power of PlayStation.
The commercials promoted PlayStation not just as a plastic box, rather as a lifestyle. By the end of 1994, the PlayStation was ready and released first in Japan. And it was a huge success, with long lines in the stores. Sony sold 100,000 consoles in the first day. But the competitors certainly were not going to just give up and were developing their own consoles. The Sega Saturn was released 11 days earlier, and at first they sold about the same. Nintendo, on the other hand, was very late with their 5th generation console. By the way, avoiding cartridges has also been beneficial. Their production took a long time, 10 or 12 weeks, and be pretty expensive. With cheaper CD discs, developers could quickly respond to demand and produce new batches in a short time. It was time to enter the American market. In 1995, Sega and Sony were supposed to show their consoles at the E3 Expo. Sega was the first to make its presentation. They announced that they would sell the console at the price of $399. It was Sony's turn. Here is Steve Race, head of development, being invited on stage for a presentation.
I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Race, to join me for a brief presentation.
He gets up on stage, brings out some papers, and prepares to make a speech.
$299.
Yes, he said $299 and left the stage to thunderous applause. That meant Sony would sell their console $100 cheaper. Sega was in a hurry to get the console to the market earlier than Sony, but it ended up negatively impacting shipments, games, and advertising. Let's talk a little bit about the games that were available for the PlayStation. Firstly, the chosen CD format impacted some games. For example, the very popular Final Fantasy VII was released on PlayStation instead of Nintendo, because the game could only fit on a CD. Nintendo was still only using cartridges for their console. Secondly, the fact that Sony was targeting an adult audience changed the games too. Since then, games are starting to be created with more memorable and complex narrative and interesting characters. For example, Metal Gear Solid has many plot twists and moral ambiguity of characters. So, Metal Gear Solid's characters more believable and likable. And it all made the game feel more like a movie. It was something new back then. Or Tomb Raider, for example, with its captivating atmosphere. Its main character, Lara Croft, was one of the first female protagonists in video games, and has since made a huge impact on pop culture. She has appeared on the covers of hundreds of magazines. Songs and books have been written about her. She has won numerous awards and even entered the Guinness Book of World Records. Many even call her the most iconic character ever.
Good luck, Lara. I fear you may need it.
I make my own luck.
Eventually, Sony won that race, and Ken Kutaragi became CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment. In the end, Sony's reliance on third-party developers, innovations, and unusual advertising were the keys to the console success. Of course, there were many ups and downs in the PlayStation's later history. A little side note. I think you know that Sega and Nintendo both had their own mascots, characters that associated with their console. For Nintendo it's Mario and for Sega it's Sonic. For Sony such a mascot became Crash Bandicoot, created by a small game studio called Naughty Dog. It won't be so iconic, but the studio would play a major role in PlayStation history. And we will talk about them in future episodes. Now let's move to nowadays. This is the time of the 9th generation consoles. The two main competitors in the home console market are Sony PlayStation 5 and Microsoft Xbox Series. What happened to Sony's main competitors at that time, Sega and Nintendo? In the early 2000s, Nintendo released its most successful console, the Wii. Nintendo is currently focusing on producing the Nintendo Switch portable console. Now you can take your console with you whenever you go. Sega, on the other hand, stopped producing consoles in 2001 and focused on producing games for PlayStation, Nintendo, and Xbox, among others. Microsoft recently acquired the Activision Blizzard game studio. Remember that first independent game studio Activision? Well, Microsoft bought them. The circle has closed, you might say. Besides that, Microsoft has officially admitted that they will lose the console war. But they don't seem too upset about it. Microsoft is actively investing in their subscription service, Xbox Game Pass. Why get involved in the console wars when you can sell your games on all platforms via subscription? And it seems like that it's something Sony has yet to answer. But despite all this, there are still a lot of people who like to play old games. Someone collects old games and old consoles. Someone organizes clubs and organizes retro games parties. Some parents introduce their children to the game they played when they were young. As for me, the story highlighted how important cooperation is. Even if you are a large corporation, you can't do everything on your own. An independent view from the outside can show your weaknesses and offer you interesting solutions to challenges. If you rely only on yourself, you are missing this advantage. Before saying goodbye, I want to ask you for a small favor. This is just the first episode of a new podcast, but I have many more stories that I want to tell you. If you enjoyed the podcast, please share it on social media. Send it to your coworkers or family. It will really help the podcast a lot. Thank you, and see you in the next one.